It was an overcast afternoon, with a cold wind blowing, when Jane stepped out of her car at the entrance to her vast estate. Dry leaves scattered across the stone driveway gave the scene an almost melancholic air, mirroring her state of mind. Jane had spent the day with old friends at an exclusive club, but upon returning home, she felt an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, a fatigue that had settled in her soul for years, though she couldn't quite pinpoint its source. To any observer, Jane seemed to have everything one could want: mansions, lucrative investments, expensive jewelry, and the respect of high society. Yet for her, all of it now seemed incredibly empty. She hadn't always felt this way. In her youth, she had been a fearless woman, diving into every experience with unmatched intensity. She had traveled the world, experienced exotic cultures, had passionate love affairs, and made deep friendships. But over time, those connections faded, and Jane withdrew into a world of her own. What once was a bold, adventurous heart gradually hardened, and the love she once had for others dwindled, almost disappearing entirely. Her footsteps echoed as she entered the mansion, climbing the stairs toward her bedroom, longing for a hot bath and a peaceful night's sleep. The mansion was steeped in absolute silence, broken only by the wind outside. Sometimes that silence brought her peace, but tonight it felt oppressive, as though every corner of the house was a reminder of the emptiness within her. Passing by the large window in the hallway with a view of the front garden, something unexpected happened. Amidst the silence, a strange sound broke the stillness, a muffled, faint cry, almost imperceptible. She stopped for a moment, frowning, trying to identify the source. It must be a cat, she thought. But as she focused, she realized the sound was different, more insistent, more human. It was the cry of a baby. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to know what city you're watching from. Tell me in the comments, and I'll leave a heart for you. Her heart raced. How long had it been since she had cared for a child? Jane had no children, and all her relatives were busy with their own lives. Now this mysterious sound seemed to reach into something deep within her. Her first impulse was to ignore it. After all, it was late and she was tired. It's probably nothing, she told herself, hoping to brush off the unsettling feeling. But the crying continued, calling out to her. Reluctantly, she put on a heavier coat and stepped outside, walking toward the front gate. With each step, she felt more vulnerable, yet oddly determined to find out what was happening. As she got closer, she realized the sound was coming from a trash bin near the wall of her property, and her heart tightened. She took a deep breath before lifting the lid, already sensing what she would find. Inside the trash bin, bundled in a worn blanket, was a baby. His large, frightened eyes, pale skin, and tiny, outstretched arms were the first things Jane saw. For a second she felt dizzy, as though the world was spinning around her. She lifted him out gently, holding him close to protect him from the cold. The baby calmed a bit, perhaps soothed by the warmth of her body, and she looked at him with a mix of shock and tenderness. It had been so long since she felt anything like this. The urgent need to protect, to care. Something deep within her, dormant for so long, was slowly awakening. As she carried the baby inside, she was flooded with thoughts and emotions she hadn't felt in years. It was as though this tiny, fragile being could touch parts of her that had been numb. Who could have done this? She wondered, with a tinge of pain and indignation. It was almost impossible for her to comprehend how anyone could abandon such a vulnerable child. Once inside, Jane placed the baby in a makeshift bed made from a soft blanket and a pillow. The little boy looked at her with curious, innocent eyes, and Jane spent a few minutes simply observing his face, taking in every little feature. She decided to name him Elvis, inspired by a distant memory of a song she used to listen to in her youth. That night, she stayed beside him, feeling a mixture of euphoria and worry. The once silent, empty house now seemed to vibrate with new energy, and every cry, every smile, every little movement from Elvis brought her a renewed sense of purpose. Deep down, She knew that something had changed, that perhaps this encounter was no coincidence. The next day, Jane called social services, but as she listened to their questions and the possibilities they offered, she realized that the thought of letting him go bothered her more than she was willing to admit. In just a few days, the baby she had found in the trash was already an integral part of her life. For the first time in years, Jane felt what it meant to truly want to protect and care for someone other than herself. In the days that followed, Jane went through a series of discoveries. She gradually learned to care for the baby, with successes and mistakes along the way. Nights of light sleep turned into sleepless nights, but the physical exhaustion didn't seem to affect her. Just being there for Elvis filled her with a new sense of purpose. Her life, once so structured and cold, now felt chaotic and unpredictable, but she couldn't imagine living any other way. And as she looked at Elvis, she felt a love she had never experienced before, a love that was unconditional and intense. As the initial adaptation period evolved into something deeper, Jane realized that the baby was awakening a humanity within her that she thought she had lost. Each day was a new adventure, a new opportunity to create memories with little Elvis. Expensive furniture, luxurious clothes and jewelry became irrelevant compared to the life she was now holding in her hands. And every smile from Elvis was a reminder that even in an apparently empty world, there was still room for love and renewal. In the weeks following Elvis's rescue, Jane experienced a profound transformation. At first, caring for a baby was more challenging than she had imagined. Used to a controlled, predictable routine, her life was now filled with little surprises that would have once irritated her, but now brought an entirely new sense of meaning. Little by little, Jane realized she was discovering parts of herself she thought were gone. In the second week, while holding Elvis, she caught a glimpse of herself in the living room mirror and was shocked by what she saw. She was smiling, not a polite social smile, but a genuine, spontaneous one. For brief moments, it was as if she could see herself again, something that hadn't happened in many years. This tiny, helpless child made her feel whole once more. Jane had never considered having children, but with Elvis, it was different. Each of his cries seemed to awaken something deep in her heart, a need to comfort and protect him, even when she had no idea what he needed. Sleepless nights, once dedicated to absolute silence and strict routines, were now filled with a new soundtrack. Elvis's soft murmurs, sudden cries, and the sound of Jane walking around the room, rocking him in her arms and singing songs she didn't even remember she knew. Elvis's small discoveries became part of Jane's journey too. He spent endless minutes exploring his own little fingers, fascinated as though he had discovered an entire universe. Watching him, Jane felt a deep warmth in her chest, a tenderness that had seemed dormant. She wondered, how could she feel so much love for someone she barely knew? The feeling was so unexpected that, at times, it brought her to tears, and she would cry, alone in the living room, while Elvis slept in his makeshift crib on the sofa, unaware that he was the reason for her tears. Determined to keep Elvis with her, Jane formally filed for adoption. The process wasn't easy. The social workers, hearing her story, were skeptical. It was unusual, after all, for such a wealthy woman with no prior interest in children to suddenly want to adopt a baby found on the street. They questioned her repeatedly, trying to understand her motivations and determine if she was fit for the task. Jane, who rarely allowed anyone to question her life, felt vulnerable, and at times doubted she would ever be granted the right to be Elvis's mother. But each time she looked at him, she felt that he was her destiny, something no one could take away from her. The days turned into weeks, and Jane and Elvis began building a routine full of little joys. She took him to the garden to feel the scent of flowers and the gentle evening breeze, and he, with his ever-curious eyes, seemed to take everything in with a fascination that made Jane feel, for the first time, like she was part of something greater than herself. One afternoon, while watching Elvis play with a new toy, Jane realized that in such a short time, he had completely changed her life. But it wasn't just the unconditional love Jane discovered. The experience also brought intense fears. One night, Jane awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding and cold sweat trickling down her face. She had dreamed that Elvis had disappeared, that she was searching for him in vain through dark, endless corridors. Though she knew it was just a dream, the panic she felt was overwhelming. She immediately got up and went to his room, making sure he was there, safe and breathing softly. Seeing him brought her peace, but the fear of the dream lingered like a shadow that would never leave. She realized then that her heart was irreversibly tied to his. As each day passed, Elvis's adjustment was evident. He seemed happier, more secure around Jane, and she began to feel whole for the first time. On one particular night, while rocking him to sleep, he looked directly into her eyes and made a soft sound, almost as if he were trying to get her attention. Jane was moved and couldn't hold back a tear. "I'm your mother, Elvis," she whispered, stroking his tiny hand. "I will protect you, always." But life with Elvis also brought a series of new challenges. He began crawling and exploring every corner of the house, which for Jane meant more work and more worries. One afternoon, while preparing lunch, Elvis crawled out to the garden and nearly fell into the fountain. Jane's heart raced when she found him so close to danger. She pulled him close, holding him tightly as she cried, promising herself that she would never let anything bad happen to him. As the months passed, Elvis became an extension of Jane, filling a void she never knew existed. They were seen as an inseparable duo. Longtime friends noticed a change in Jane, saying she seemed lighter, more open, and even more willing to listen. Some club friends visited her and were amazed to see Jane, who had once been so reserved, sitting on the living room floor, laughing and playing with Elvis. They whispered among themselves about how he had transformed her, but none of them truly understood the impact this little one had on her life. Finally, after months of waiting and procedures, Jane was officially granted the adoption. When she received the news, she was so overwhelmed that she had to sit down to take it all in. Elvis was now officially her son. She looked at him, who stared back with those big, curious eyes, and felt as if all the challenges she had faced had been worth it. He was hers in every way that mattered. That night, she put him to bed, and as she watched his small body gently stir, she made a silent promise. She would dedicate the rest of her life to ensuring Elvis's happiness. No treasure, no material possession held more value for her than his smile and well-being. It was as if she had been chosen in some mysterious way to be the guardian of this little being. The house, once opulent but devoid of meaning, now echoed with laughter and play, and Jane felt alive again. She knew her journey with Elvis would still bring many challenges, but for the first time, she felt strong enough to face them. And so, with Elvis in her arms, Jane drifted into a peaceful sleep, believing that she had finally found her purpose. With the adoption official, Jane and Elvis embarked on a new chapter in their lives. Now, they were officially mother and son. Jane experienced a kind of happiness she had scarcely believed possible. For the first time, it wasn't the sparkle of jewelry or the balance in her bank account that brought her satisfaction. It was Elvis's laughter, the way he stretched his little arms out to her when he woke up, and the warmth of his body in her long hugs. Jane's once pristine and silent routine had transformed into a dance of laughter, toys scattered across the floor, and messes she never minded. Every part of her home seemed taken over by this new life. Every day, Jane was amazed by Elvis's curiosity and how quickly he learned. He was already starting to babble his first words and take his first wobbly steps. Every little milestone, every achievement was celebrated with laughter and applause that echoed through the house. Elvis tried to walk toward Jane, holding onto the sofa cushions, and she, on her knees, encouraged him with sweet words and patience. In that moment, Jane's world revolved around Elvis's confident smile and the way he looked at her as if she were his entire universe. But it wasn't just the happy moments that defined their relationship. Jane also faced the pains and challenges that came with motherhood. One night during dinner, Elvis choked while trying to eat on his own. Jane panicked, her heart nearly stopping, and with trembling hands, she helped him. The relief of seeing him okay again made her break down in tears, and she hugged him tightly. This type of fear was new for her, so different from any other worry she had ever had. It was a raw, visceral fear that made her realize just how far she would go for this little one. Jane dedicated herself to giving Elvis a full childhood. She read books on childcare, bought educational toys, and took him to parks so he could interact with other children. However, each time someone asked about Elvis's father or how she had come to have him, Jane felt on the edge of a cliff. She didn't mind explaining, but she feared the world wouldn't understand how a baby found in such sad circumstances could be the only true light in her life. And even without telling their story, she could see curiosity and doubt in others' eyes. As the months went by, Jane began to plan for Elvis's future like any dedicated mother. She established a study routine, set up a savings account, and dreamed of every detail of his adult life. He would be strong, determined, and have all the opportunities she herself never had. But as much as she tried to plan everything, she knew that life was full of uncertainties, and the possibility that something could disrupt their happiness brought a gnawing anxiety that Jane tried her best to ignore. Then one sunny afternoon, life reminded Jane harshly that not everything was under her control. She had prepared a snack in the garden while Elvis played in a plastic pool. He laughed and splashed, trying with his tiny hands to catch the bubbles floating around him. Jane watched him with a serene smile, feeling completely at peace. In her mind, nothing could be more perfect than those moments with him. Jane turned away for just a second to grab Elvis's towel. But in an instant, the sound of splashing stopped. When she looked back, her heart froze. Elvis was floating face down, motionless. Jane felt the ground give way beneath her feet and ran desperately to the pool. With a cry muffled by anguish, she pulled him out and laid him on the ground, trying to get him to breathe. His body seemed too small, too fragile, and the color of his face terrified her. She screamed, trying to recall the resuscitation techniques she had seen in movies, pressing on his tiny chest as tears of pure despair fell from her eyes. Each second felt like an eternity, and her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. No, he can't. Not now. Not after everything we've been through. Her vision blurred with tears, but she kept going, refusing to believe that this was the end. Finally, Elvis coughed lightly, expelling water, and started to breathe. Jane held him close to her chest, sobbing and whispering almost inaudibly, "You're okay. You're okay." The relief she felt upon seeing him open his eyes was so intense that her legs nearly gave out, and she almost fell. Carrying him inside, her hands still trembling, she promised herself that nothing would ever come close to hurting him again. No matter what it took, she would do everything to protect him. This experience was a brutal reminder of life's fragility and the importance of treasuring every second with those we love. But the shock didn't end there. In the days that followed, Elvis had episodes of fever and trouble sleeping. Jane was exhausted, but she stayed awake beside him, watching over his sleep and monitoring his every move. She consulted pediatricians, ran tests, but the doctors found nothing wrong. "Maybe it's just trauma," they said. But Jane knew that the fear was eating away at her, making her question every small change in Elvis's behavior. He, who once loved baths and playtime, now cried at the sight of water. Jane understood. The trauma was hers too, and they would both need time to overcome it. Jane and Elvis's bond grew even stronger. Every moment with him felt like a gift, something she never wanted to lose. Yet the experience of the accident had revealed something unexpected to her. The certainty that their lives, as planned as they were subject to uncontrollable forces. And as much as Jane tried to hide her fear, a part of her worried that the world might somehow try to take him away from her. It was then that a new thought arose. What if something from her past could explain her improbable encounter with Elvis? Since finding him, Jane had never questioned why he had appeared to her specifically, as if fate had arranged everything for their lives to intersect. In the silence of the nights, as Elvis slept in her arms, she began to think more deeply about life's twists and turns and mysteries that might not have answers. The unease grew. With each glance they shared, each smile and touch, Jane felt an almost inexplicable bond with him, as if he had always been a part of her. Was our meeting really a coincidence, she wondered. The answer, however unlikely it seemed, was an undeniable truth she couldn't ignore. Elvis wasn't just someone to love, but a deep connection that filled a void inside her, a void she hadn't even realized was there. With these thoughts weighing on her, Jane promised herself she would never stop searching for the truth, if there was indeed a truth to be uncovered. Her new life with Elvis was all that mattered, but now a shadow hung over her. And deep down, Jane knew that, sooner or later, this story would need answers. Jane barely slept in the weeks following Elvis's accident. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived that moment, like a terrible scene replaying over and over in her mind, each time more intense and real. Elvis's pale face, the stillness of the water, the feeling of terror and helplessness, they were images that haunted her. Deep down, she knew she needed to overcome the fear, but it was as if every moment with him was both a gift and a dark reminder that life can change in the blink of an eye. For Jane, the accident wasn't just an unfortunate incident. She felt as though the world had tried to take him from her, as if some greater force was testing her love and determination. Each time she thought about it, the vulnerability overwhelmed her, and she did everything possible to hold back her tears. But the trauma followed her. Even in moments of happiness, a shadow of apprehension lingered over her heart. Each time Elvis laughed, she responded with a guarded smile, fearing that somehow the happiness she felt could be suddenly taken away. In an effort to calm both herself and Elvis, Jane began to establish a new routine. Now, the pool was a forbidden zone, and even Elvis's baths had become quick and cautious. He, still affected by the trauma, cried and struggled at the sight of water, and Jane tried to comfort him with a calm voice, though the fear consumed her too. During those first baths after the accident, she would cry alongside him, holding him tightly, whispering words of love and protection, as if trying to ward off the ghost of that traumatic experience with each word. Jane's day-to-day became more focused on Elvis than ever. She distanced herself from friends, from old social commitments, and the once lively house, filled with parties and lavish events, transformed into a private sanctuary where only one thing mattered: Elvis's safety. Jane, who once valued status and appearances, began to care less about others' opinions and focused exclusively on her son. He was her world, her reason for being. Nothing and no one could interfere with the life she was building with him. Time, however, didn't seem to be enough to ease the insecurities the accident had awakened. Jane started to be consumed by an almost obsessive need to monitor Elvis's every move, as though she feared he might vanish at any moment. She watched him while he slept, checking his breathing every few hours to ensure everything was okay. At times, she would stop and wonder if that level of worry was normal, but each time her mind questioned, her heart would rush to answer, "It doesn't matter. He's everything to me." One day, after a long night of nightmares, Jane decided she needed to do something to ease her suffering. She sought out a therapist, someone who could help her deal with her fears and rebuild her confidence in her ability to protect Elvis. During the first session, the words came slowly, as though a weight held them back. But with the therapist's encouragement, she managed to open up about everything that tormented her. She talked about the rescue, about the deep love she felt, and about the fear that seemed rooted in her chest, threatening every step she took. The therapist listened carefully, and after a moment of reflection asked, "Have you ever considered why this fear is so intense? Perhaps there's something more, beyond the accident, that's causing you to feel this way." Jane was puzzled. What was he trying to say? But at the same time, an uncomfortable feeling arose in her mind, a doubt she had been trying to ignore since Elvis came into her life. That night, as she returned home, Jane found herself pondering Elvis's story. She couldn't forget the way he had come into her life, a tiny, helpless baby left in a trash bin. How many times had she wondered about his biological parents? Who would have had the courage to do something so cruel? And more importantly, why did there seem to be such an intense connection between them, something that transcended any logical explanation? For months, she had pushed these thoughts away, but now, with the trauma of the accident and her constant fear of losing him, those questions were surfacing as inevitable truths. Gradually, Jane took small but significant steps to investigate Elvis's past. One quiet afternoon, while Elvis slept, Jane picked up the phone and made a few calls. She contacted friends who might be able to help her get information about the area where she had found him, and reached out to her contacts in social services to see if there were any records of abandoned infants in the region, any clue that could help her understand what had happened. The answers, however, were frustrating. There were no precise records, no concrete leads. It was as if Elvis's story had been erased, or as if he hadn't existed to the world until the moment Jane found him. The feeling of emptiness grew, but Jane didn't let it stop her. She felt that something still needed to be discovered, that there was a hidden truth in his story, an invisible connection only she could understand. For days, this secret search for Elvis's past consumed Jane's time and mind. She began to obsess over every little detail, any possible clue that might lead her to an answer. At the same time, her bond with Elvis became even more intense. The little boy seemed to pick up on her anxiety, and though he was too young to understand, he constantly sought the comfort of her presence, as if sensing that there was something unresolved between them. One rainy night, as Elvis slept and the sound of raindrops filled the silence of the house, Jane had a revelation. Sitting by his crib, her heart racing, she realized that it didn't matter what the truth of his past was. Elvis was here with her, and that was all that mattered. She was his mother, and he was her son. The rest of the world, with all its mysteries and uncertainties, had no power to change that. The peace she felt, however, lasted only a few moments. Jane knew that the past was a persistent force, something that sooner or later always resurfaces. And deep down, she feared what might happen if Elvis's true story came to light. There was something inexplicable about their bond, an intensity that felt like more than a simple maternal connection. It was as if they were, in some way, parts of the same story, destined to cross paths by forces beyond her understanding. That night marked a turning point for Jane. Determined not to let fear guide her actions anymore, she made a new promise to herself. Not only would she protect Elvis from any threat, but she would also uncover the truth, no matter the consequences. If there was something in her past that connected the two in an invisible way, she would face that truth with courage. She was ready for anything, as long as Elvis remained safe by her side. When the sun rose the next morning, Jane felt stronger and more determined. She knew that the journey to uncover the truth about Elvis wouldn't be easy, but she wouldn't allow any secret to threaten the life they had built together. Holding his tiny hand as he slept, she whispered softly, "No matter what the past says, I'll be with you, always." The following days were a blur of emotions and despair. Jane spent countless hours by Elvis's side, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, holding his little hand, and trying to ignore the constant, monotonous beeping of the machines. Elvis's small body looked even smaller in that hospital bed, surrounded by wires and monitors. His pale face, so different from the smile that usually lit up the house, was a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. On the first day, the doctors asked Jane to go home and rest, but she refused. How could she sleep when her son lay there unconscious, fighting for his life? From the start, she decided she would stay by his side no matter how long it took. She wanted Elvis to know somehow that he wasn't alone. And so, Jane entered an exhausting routine with no breaks for rest, surviving on the watery coffee from the hospital cafeteria and resisting fatigue to stay by her son's side. Nights were the hardest. During the day, Jane tried to keep up a strong, resilient front, but when the silence of the night enveloped the hospital room, the weight of her sadness became almost unbearable. She whispered words of love and hope into Elvis's ear, making promises that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Each night was an internal battle, a struggle against the growing despair, while her heart desperately longed to see Elvis's bright eyes one more time. On one of those lonely nights, Jane finally succumbed to exhaustion, resting her head beside Elvis's bed. She slept for a few hours, and when she awoke, the sun was already peeking timidly through the window blinds. She looked at her son, hoping, as always, for a miracle, hoping to see his eyes open. But he remained still, and her gaze reflected the fatigue and fear that had accumulated day after day. The silence in the room felt oppressive, as if the very air was waiting for something that might never happen. But Jane wasn't willing to give up. Every day she read to Elvis, talked about the little things they would do together when he woke up, reminded him of the happy moments at home and the toys still waiting for him. She believed, with a nearly desperate faith, that he needed to hear her voice, feel her presence, to find the strength to fight. "You're strong, my love," she whispered. "Mommy's here waiting for you. Everything will be okay." Though the doctors were professional and caring, they began to express doubts about Elvis's recovery. They explained to Jane that due to his prolonged unconsciousness, it was likely he would suffer from damage, possibly irreversible, to his development. Each time they mentioned this possibility, Jane's heart tightened, but she refused to accept any diagnosis that predicted a life without fullness for her son. Elvis was a fighter, and Jane believed he would return to being the cheerful boy he had always been. Days turned into weeks, and Jane's hope wavered like a fragile flame. Every morning she tried to renew herself, but the physical and emotional exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Her eyes, once bright with determination, now reflected the weight of sleepless nights and endless days. Friends visited, brought support, and tried to convince her to rest, but Jane barely listened. The outside world seemed irrelevant. Everything that mattered was right there, in that small hospital bed where Elvis silently fought. Then, one morning, when Jane's hope was nearly extinguished, the impossible happened. She was sitting beside Elvis, holding his hand as she did every day, when she felt a faint movement. Initially, she thought it was an illusion caused by exhaustion, but then she looked closer and saw his little fingers moving. Her heart raced. "Elvis," she called, her voice trembling. At first there was no response, but then very slowly his eyes began to open. Jane could hardly believe what she was seeing. His eyes, still unfocused, wandered around the room until they finally found her face. He blinked a few times, as if trying to understand where he was. Jane swallowed hard, her heart pounding uncontrollably, and a single tear ran down her cheek. "Elvis, it's me, Mommy," she said, in a whisper. His reaction was subtle, but noticeable. Elvis's face relaxed slightly, and he seemed to recognize her, though his gaze remained somewhat vacant. Jane couldn't hold back her emotion and began to cry, holding his hand more firmly, as if afraid he might slip away again. In the days that followed, she noticed that Elvis hadn't regained his full memory, but he watched her with a tenderness that went beyond words or memories. Even without fully understanding, Elvis knew that this woman beside him was special, someone he could trust. Jane devoted every second to Elvis's recovery, helping him rediscover the world. Slowly, his memories returned. One sunny afternoon, as he held a familiar toy, he looked at her with a sparkle in his eyes that Jane would never forget. In a sweet, fragile voice, he said, "Mommy," and Jane's heart exploded with emotion. That word sounded magical, almost like music to Jane's ears. She hugged him tightly, tears flowing freely. It was the first time Elvis had called her mommy since the accident, and that simple word carried the weight of their entire journey together. He recognized her, not just as the person who cared for him, but as his mother, the one who loved him unconditionally, even in the darkest times. For Jane, that moment was the confirmation of everything she had always believed. All the fear, pain, and doubt, it all faded away at the sound of that word. She felt whole, renewed, as if she had finally arrived at a safe place after a long storm. Elvis was back, and he knew who she was. After waking up, Elvis's recovery was slow but full of progress. Every little achievement, from his first words to his first steps without help, was celebrated with joy and excitement. Jane knew there was still a long way to go, but just seeing him laugh and call her mommy was enough to make everything worthwhile. They had faced the deepest fear and had come out victorious together. As they walked hand in hand, with Jane holding his little hand, she looked at him with indescribable pride. He was a miracle, proof that love could overcome any obstacle. And now, more than ever, Jane knew that nothing in this world could separate them. Elvis's awakening marked not only his recovery, but also Jane's rebirth. In the days that followed, she lived in a constant state of gratitude, as if each of Elvis's smiles was a blessing, each word a reminder of how special he was. The word miracle became a constant thought for her. After all, how many times had she almost lost hope? How many nights had she kept vigil, whispering words of love and encouragement, hoping he could hear her? Now, Elvis was back. Though still fragile and recovering, he seemed stronger and more determined every day. With Jane's support, he began to regain his movements and words, as if he were learning everything again, but with a curiosity that charmed her. Jane watched each new achievement with shining eyes and a racing heart, as though witnessing a miracle with each tiny step. Seeing Elvis run to her with open arms, stumbling but laughing, filled Jane with pride and joy beyond anything she had ever felt. Elvis was still relearning certain words and skills, and Jane made sure that every interaction was filled with patience and love. Each word he spoke, each innocent laugh, was a victory, another step toward building a safe and loving home. "Mommy," he would say, reaching out to her, and the sound of that word, once just a simple combination of syllables, now carried the weight of their struggle, hope, and the unconditional love they shared. One spring afternoon, Jane took Elvis to the park for the first time since the accident. She was anxious, fearful that contact with the outside world might be too exhausting or worse, threatening. But Elvis, feeling the wind on his face and seeing the green grass all around, reacted with contagious joy. He ran, tried to catch the butterflies that flew by, and laughed at the sound of the birds. Jane watched from a distance, sitting on a bench with tears in her eyes. This was the picture of a dream come true, a victory achieved after a long, arduous battle. However, as Elvis played, Jane allowed herself to reflect on something that had been quietly settling in her mind for a long time. Elvis's past was still a mystery. No matter how much she loved him and considered him her son in every way, the mystery of his origins continued to hover over them like a shadow. Watching him run carefree, Jane felt a mix of relief and unease. Who were his biological parents? How had he ended up with her? Although it was hard to accept, a part of her knew that, eventually, she would have to face these questions, both for herself and for him. In the weeks that followed, Elvis returned to physical therapy sessions and medical appointments, and Jane made sure to keep track of every detail of his recovery. At each visit, she listened to the progress, the doctor's recommendations, and also the warnings. "It's important that he doesn't experience any more trauma," they said. And Jane nodded, aware of how much he had suffered, determined to protect him from anything that could hurt him. But there was something the doctors couldn't foresee. The questions Elvis would inevitably start to ask, and the first time he looked at Jane and asked, with a child's simple curiosity, "Where did I come from, Mommy?" her heart seemed to stop. Jane hesitated, not knowing how to respond. She had prepared so many answers for the questions that would come over time, but this one, which seemed so simple, left her in a panic. "You came from a very special place, my love," she answered with a trembling smile. Elvis, innocent and trusting, smiled back and ran off to play, but Jane sat there with his question echoing in her mind. She knew he wouldn't be satisfied forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face the truth about Elvis's past and explain where he had really come from. That night, after putting Elvis to bed, Jane sat on the edge of his bed and watched his peaceful sleep. Her curiosity about his past was consuming her, and she found herself unable to ignore this mystery any longer. She felt there was something important to discover, something that could shed new light on what fate had set in motion by bringing Elvis into her life. After many sleepless nights, Jane made a decision. She would find someone who could help her investigate Elvis's past. She hired a private investigator and gave him all the information she had: the place where she had found him, descriptions of the objects he had with him, anything that could, in some way, offer a clue about his origin. "What am I doing?" she would ask herself at times, fearing that discovering the truth might open a wound that would never heal. But at the same time, she knew it was something she needed to do, both for herself and for Elvis. The investigator worked for weeks, but the initial results didn't yield many answers. There were no reports of disappearances that matched Elvis's age at the time he was found, nor were there clues as to who might have left him behind. Jane felt frustrated, but each passing day only increased her determination. She wouldn't give up until she found some truth about his past, a truth that might explain the deep bond she felt. One day, while waiting for more news from the investigator, Jane was sorting through some old papers when she found a photo that made her pause. It was a picture of her mother, a woman with bright eyes and a warm smile who had always believed that everything in life happens for a reason. Jane remembered how her mother used to talk about the importance of welcoming the unexpected, of trusting what life brought. And now, looking at Elvis, she felt he was exactly that, an unexpected gift, something life had given her to fill a void she hadn't known existed. Days turned into weeks, and although the investigator didn't bring any major revelations, something started to change within Jane. The search for the truth about Elvis's past had become a personal mission, but she also understood that she might never get all the answers. After all, what truly mattered was the love she felt for him, a love that transcended any doubts or uncertainties. Finally, the investigator returned with something surprising. He had discovered that there were records of missing children in the region, children who had been left in isolated places in conditions similar to Elvis's. Although there was nothing specific to prove Elvis's connection to those records, the possibility that he had been part of something larger and more painful than she had imagined made her shiver. Jane's questions only multiplied, and she found herself at a crossroads. Keep pushing for answers or protect Elvis from a truth he might not be ready to face. In the end, Jane decided to keep what she had discovered to herself, at least for now. If one day Elvis wanted to know more about his origins, she would support him in seeking answers. But until then, she would content herself with living in the present, being the mother he needed, and giving him a life full of love and safety. That night, as she put him to bed, Jane realized how unconditional and deep her love for him had become. He could have any origin, carry any story. None of it would change what he meant to her. With one last kiss on his forehead, she lay down beside him, finally feeling at peace. Throughout their journey, Jane and Elvis had become a true family, something that transcended blood or biological ties. They were two souls bound by a love that defied explanation. Jane knew the future might still hold surprises, but for the first time, she felt completely ready to face it. After all, nothing in the world was more important than the love they shared. The months went by quickly for Jane and Elvis, and life seemed at last to settle into a calm routine. The traumas of the past had been partly overcome, and their bond grew stronger and more genuine with each passing day. Yet, Jane's lingering curiosity about Elvis's past persisted, and she continued to seek answers. The mystery of who had left him, or who he really was, left an emptiness that she, despite all her efforts, couldn't ignore. She felt that to offer him a complete future, she would need to resolve the question that still hovered over the beginning of his story. After much reflection, Jane decided to hire a private investigator to try and uncover Elvis's origins. The search was long and fraught with difficulties, but she never gave up. Each visit to the investigator's office, each tiny clue, brought new hopes and new doubts. The past always seemed just within reach, yet something invisible kept it hidden, as if there were a truth that refused to be revealed. One day, after weeks of frustrating investigations, Jane received a call from the investigator. His tone was serious, but held a hint of hope. "I think we've found something concrete," he said cautiously. With her heart racing, Jane went to the office, both anxious and afraid. Could it be that she was finally about to understand what really happened to Elvis? Upon arrival, the investigator greeted her with a worried look and led her to a private room. On the table was a folder containing documents, photos, and a note yellowed with age. "These are records from the hospital where Elvis was born," the investigator explained carefully. "It all happened the same night you found him, and according to the documents, he was taken from there by his biological mother." Jane held her breath. With each word, Elvis's past seemed to come into sharper focus, like a shadow gradually taking form. The investigator continued in a serious, compassionate tone. "Apparently, Elvis's mother was a young woman in a difficult situation. She arrived at the hospital without any identification and was visibly distressed. She gave birth alone and left the hospital a few hours later, taking Elvis with her. It seems that sometime that night, she left him near where you found him." Jane looked at the yellowed note the investigator handed her gently. It held only a few words, but each one pulsed with the suffering and love of a mother who knew she couldn't care for her son, but still wanted to give him a chance at a better life. Trembling, Jane read the words scrawled on the paper. "To whoever finds him, please take care of him. I love him, but I can't give him what he deserves. May he have a better chance." Reading the note, Jane felt tears well up. The intensity of that mother's love, willing to leave her son in the hope that someone would find him and give him a good life, deeply touched Jane. As much as she wanted to be the only point of reference in Elvis's life, she understood the sacrifice his biological mother had made, and it filled her heart with bittersweet pain. She imagined that young woman walking alone through the night, carrying a baby she knew she couldn't keep, and finally, in a moment of desperation, choosing to leave him somewhere he could be found. Noticing Jane's pain, the investigator continued speaking, trying to show the delicate nature of this abandonment. "Sometimes, Mrs. Jane, people make sacrifices that only those in extreme situations can understand. Perhaps she thought he would have a better chance being found by someone, and in a way, that's exactly what happened." Jane nodded slowly, absorbing what she had learned. She had found Elvis, yes, but he had also found her. She was convinced of that. The few words in the note didn't lessen the bond she had with Elvis. On the contrary, they only deepened her love for him. Jane knew then that fate had charted an exact course for that boy to end up in her arms. Back at home, Jane felt transformed. Although she had finally found answers, they brought more than just clarity. They brought a greater purpose, a sense of mission in her role as Elvis's mother. Now that she understood the sacrifice his biological mother had made, she vowed to herself that Elvis would never feel the pain of abandonment. He wasn't just an adopted child, he was a miracle, a gift life had brought her in an unexpected and extraordinary way. In the days that followed, Jane looked at Elvis with a renewed depth. Each smile, each hug, each laugh came with a silent gratitude. Watching him play in the garden, she felt as though she were living a dream she had never imagined possible. All the suffering, all the doubts, all the fears seemed to have been necessary for this unconditional love to blossom, now stronger than ever. That night, as she put him to bed, Jane gently stroked his face and whispered, "You were loved from the very start, my son. Your first mother loved you so much that she had to let you go so you could have a better chance, and I was lucky enough to be the one to give you that life." These words carried a profound truth, an understanding Jane had never had before. What mattered now was the future, and she would be there to guide every step of Elvis's way, offering him all the love and protection he deserved. And so Jane and Elvis's life continued in peace, but also with a sense of purpose. She knew that one day he would ask about his origins, and now she felt ready to answer. She knew that at the right time, he would understand his biological mother's sacrifice and recognize the true love that had surrounded him from the very beginning. That love, coming from two different mothers, was what made him special, what made his story unique and his life priceless. Years later, when Elvis was older and beginning to understand the world with more clarity, he looked at Jane with his characteristic innocence and asked, "Mommy, why did you find me that day?" Jane smiled, stroking his face with tenderness. "Because I was waiting for you, Elvis. I was always waiting for you.